So why are we here? The inauguration is obviously coming up very soon, and if we go by a list of the public statements of the president-elect, we're in for big changes in foreign policy. So there's I could sit here and go through all of the, name your favorite tweet, but that would take too long. A non-exhaustive list includes changes in our relationships with Russia, China, and our allies, open doubts about the relevance of nuclear non-proliferation, a potential unraveling of TPP, the Iran deal, and the Paris Accord, a general distrust of alliances and multilateralism, and a shift between focusing on soft power to increasingly focusing on hard power. Now, there's good news for us as faculty. These things are what we like to call teachable moments. And it's teachable moments in two senses. Teachable moments not just in sort of sharing our kind of professional toolkit to help frame ways to think about the next 4 years, but also in something that we're all going to need a great deal of is modeling appropriate public discourse. And so there's obviously no better way to do that than in a public forum. So if we're true to the notion that Seton Hall is a place where leaders learn, then this means that this university now has a great job to do to inspire and educate future engaged citizens. And we need to remind ourselves of this now more than ever. So that having been said, I'll introduce everyone. I'm Martin Edwards. I'm an associate professor. I teach classes in research methods, international organizations. And then going this way, which is the order of our speaking today, I am Nabil Alam, who's an assistant professor and teaches sustainable development and our economics classes. Ben Goldfrank, an associate professor who teaches classes in Latin America. Sarah Muller, an assistant professor who teaches classes on international security. Anne Marie Murphy, who is an associate professor and teaches classes on foreign policy in Southeast Asia. And then Father Brian Bouzas, who is an assistant professor and teaches classes on IR theory and our UN field seminar. So I want to thank them as well for their enthusiasm about this project. They didn't have to say yes to this crazy idea, but they did, and for that, I'd like to thank them. So what we'll do is proceed according to the alphabet. I have some comments that are UN related, and given my understanding of the alphabet, that means I'll be speaking after Nabila and before Ben. And so I'll insert myself at the appropriate time. What I've asked everyone to do today is to prepare about 5 to 7 minutes of comments, and we'll have time at the end for Q&A. Okay? Several of us have to teach at 2, so this will be, for those of us who will be putting stuff in our bags, a very hard stop. Okay? All right. So that having been said, I'd like to introduce our first member of our panel, Dr. Nabil Alam.
Thanks, Martin, for arranging this. I'm very pleased to speak here today, and it's nice to be here with the rest of the panel, and I look forward to your questions as well at the end. So there's a lot to talk about in terms of economic events in terms of the next administration, but I'll focus my remarks on 2 areas. It's trade, especially related to China, and then afterwards talking about development in the African continental context. So in terms of trade, we know that President-elect Trump ran on a campaign on, among other things, bringing back jobs. And part of how he sees that he's going to do that is by putting on tariffs against China to restrict trade, which is going to force US manufacturing jobs to increase. Now, a lot of us see a problem with that logic because trade today is quite different from what trade was about 20, 30 years ago. It's no longer that different countries produce whole products and we just import the goods. There is a whole global supply chain that's involved. So basically the stuff that we're importing, we're actually putting into goods that we make and then export. So So if we're actually putting on tariffs on goods that are coming in, we're potentially hurting our own exports. So that's one area. Now, I'm not sure whether the new administration would go as far as to bring up 30%, 40% tariffs as has been suggested. But even yesterday at the Davos meetings, apparently Anthony Scarzuzzi had said that if the tariffs are brought on, China should not retaliate, because if there is a trade war, then US would win. To which President Xi Jinping said that no one wins in a trade war. And we know this from the 1930s Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which is an important point of departure for starting all econ classes in trade, right? And the reason that's really important is because once that trade war started, at the end of a recession and trying to actually save jobs and trying to boost jobs in the U.S., all countries, all the major countries around the world actually suffered as a result. And it was part of the reason why the Great Depression was prolonged. It was part of the reason why the World War I, as a result, would also come on because of the economic difficulties as well. So we have a very good lesson in history to take away from trade wars, right? The lesson is don't do it. Now, having said that, trade with China does play an important role in the U.S. We've heard a lot of talk about how trade with China is costing the U.S. jobs. Now, this is true to some extent in the sense that when China joined the World Trade Organization in 2000, that's when we see an impact on a lot of manufacturing jobs in the U.S. That's when jobs went down. But many economists who study this actually say that that was a one-time big shock. There have been other trade agreements with other countries, liberalizing trade. There are adjustments to jobs that happen. Some jobs are lost, others are gained. The trade with China joining just by its sheer size and the fact that it was manufacturing, it's competing in a lot of different areas, the size was big. But even given that, the proportion of jobs that can be attributed to loss due to trade is about 20 to 25%, which means that we are missing a whole other part of job loss in the US that needs to be addressed through appropriate policy. I'm not going to go into the details of what those policies would look like. If you're interested, we can talk about it later. Now, talking about the big picture in general in terms of trade, China, regional powers, Professor Edwards had just talked about TPP probably not happening. Now, the interesting thing over here is that when we think about China and the U.S., China is seen as a specter, kind of. It's taking over. It's U.S. is losing its preeminence in the world to China, and by withdrawing from the TPP, the U.S. would actually be facilitating that to some extent, because U.S. is withdrawing as a power in the Asia Pacific, right? So part of the TPP was to provide a rules-based system of trade in that area, which China would then be, China is not part of the TPP, but it would be forced to join later after the rules were made. So that's one area to think about. Now, there are also repercussions in terms of TTIP not being put forward. Now, whether you agree or not with the trade agreements, one of the impacts over here we would see is between the transatlantic relations between U.S. and Europe, which I'm sure Professor Muller is going to talk more about later. But there's a trade aspect of it too, where TTIP doesn't go through, or if it goes through on certain terms, there could be a rift as well. And just today I saw on the Independent, I think, that apparently China has decided to forego opening 85 new coal power plants, and instead is going to put in a lot of money, I think about $300 billion or so over the next 5-10 years into renewable energy. So if you think about another of the areas where President-elect Trump has said he's bring back jobs, it's in coal, right? So that's another area where China would be going ahead. So in terms of if we're thinking about leading in areas, we're actually already moving away from areas where we should be leading in. So that's trade and China, and then the regional aspects of it. I want to talk a little bit about development in the African context as well. So I think in the last few days there has been the transition team, the Trump transition team has asked the Development Office, so USAID and Millennium Challenge Account, about the importance of the aid program in Africa. Basically, they're asking whether it's effective, why should we give aid to corrupt African governments, does it work at all? How are we competing with China in businesses in Africa? These questions are alarming. It's alarming because there has been a lot of work done in the last couple of decades to try to reform aid. There have been a lot of problems with it. To try to reform aid, to try to make it more accountable, to try to make it more useful to the countries in which aid is given to. There's more work to be done over there, but it's moving in the right direction. And some of the programs that have been that are operating in the continent over there are very important. So you might have heard of PEPFAR, started under the Bush administration, so Bush Jr. And that's been a very important program in trying to combat HIV/AIDS and getting drugs to people in need over there. And the other one is the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which was signed in under the Obama administration as well. And these are very important opportunities. So the second one actually looks through electrification and other institutional measures, other infrastructure initiatives that can be put together in the continent, which are going to be important for long-term development and growth. And as to what Dr. Edwards had said before about soft power versus hard power, this would be one of the means of soft power, where you're creating goodwill, but you're also investing in institutions and development, and not just the business aspect of things, which are important for a growing continent. I think I'll stop over here, and I will pass the baton back to Dr. Edwards. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nabila. So my comments are about the relationship of the new administration to the United Nations, and I'll make 4 observations. First, the immediate challenge for the UN lies not in dealing with the White House, but it lies in dealing with the US Congress. If you've been following what's been going on in Congress as of late, a couple of days ago, Senators Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham introduced a bill, and this is one of only many that are under consideration in both houses, that will, in response to the Security Council resolution that was critical of Israel, completely defund the UN. So this includes assessed contributions and voluntary contributions. This includes the UN and UN specialized agencies. So this means peacekeeping, this means High Commissioner for Human Rights, this means High Commissioner for Refugees, this means specialized agencies such as the World Health Organization and the World Bank. All of these are at risk. Now Graham's statement on this was, and I quote, "We're going to stop the money until we get this fixed." Okay? Now we need to be mindful of what that is, what that means, right? Because what the fix is that it would require the Security Council to reverse a resolution. Now, as you are all no doubt well aware, the Security Council is comprised of member countries. So the fix is that countries would have to change their votes. And it's certainly unclear why countries would want to do this. It's absolutely unclear why permanent members would want to do this. So, and there have been issues at times in our history where this issue about UN funding has come up. It came up in the 90s. And in response to that, the Secretary of State, Richard Holbrooke, at the time, who was often fond of explaining to Congress that blaming the United Nations for failings in the Security Council is like threatening to punish Madison Square Garden when the Knicks lose. Now, some of you might think this is a parallel. The Knicks aren't playing well now, but that's another topic for another day. So bills like this come up every session. That's certainly Congress's right to do. UN bashing is a popular sport in Congress. But what the White House did with this issue and the abstention was it made it incredibly easy for members to voice support, because now they have coupled the concerns that many might have with the United Nations with support for Israel. Okay? So had the Obama administration vetoed this resolution, we wouldn't be having a discussion about this resolution. Now, will this pass? You know, it's coupled with support of Israel, so it'd be hard-pressed to imagine circumstances under which some sort of budget cut for the UN won't pass the Senate. I mean, you have to think pragmatically, is there anyone in the administration who's going to speak out against this? You didn't hear anything from Tillerson's confirmation that suggests that he would. And if you heard Nikki Haley this morning, you most assuredly didn't hear anything in her statement that suggests that she would fight against this. So we have a moment in which the UN is providing more peacekeepers on the ground than ever before. We have a moment in which the UN is dealing with the greatest humanitarian crisis in decades, and we are about to ask it to do more with less. Now, one of the things that Dr. Alam mentioned was a little bit of historical context, and this is not the world of the 1990s, in which the U.S. is effectively the only power on the block. Other countries with other agendas that might not share a lot of the preferences that the U.S. have might very well step up their contributions in response to this threatened aid cut. And so at that point, Congress will have to choose between principle and reality. And that reality is that they have just chosen to diminish American influence. So, point 2. In an important sense, President Trump does understand the value of the UN. And he has actually made a public statement that has said that. When he nominated Nikki Haley as ambassador, he said 2 things. He said Haley knows how to make deals, and he also said we're going to make a lot of deals in the UN in the coming years. And so that's a teachable moment for us, because what that does tell us is that the President-elect Trump recognizes the value of the UN, which is, of course, efficiency. This is a place where you can speak to 193 countries across a whole range of issues. There's nowhere else that you can do that. Okay? And President-elect Trump is going to have the chance to do this sooner rather than later. The U.S. holds the presidency of the Security Council in April. So one of the things that the foreign policy team is going to have to start planning is this big question of what are we going to use that month where we hold the presidency to do. And the foreign policy team, in part because it's largely comprised of outsiders, doesn't offer us a whole lot of clues. Thus the question. Are we using that month? Are we using the UN to advance our interests? Are we using it to push for sanctions on North Korea? Some sort of possible peace deal as a result of our newfound friendship with Russia and Syria? Are we using it to help the UN raise money for humanitarian emergencies? Are we going to continue to use it as the White House, the Obama White House has done, to internationalize the war against ISIS? Or not? So put another way, President-elect Trump has referred to the UN as, quote, having great potential. But it raises the question for us about what he wants the UN to actually do. And this speaks to part of the foreign policy process challenge that's facing this new administration. Is the White House going to drive U.S. engagement with the UN in a positive way? That was, in a sense, part of the thrust of Nikki Haley's remarks this morning. Or is that narrative going to be largely shaped by Congress and its desire to strip the UN of money? So the answer to that question about process is going to tell us whether this month of April, in which the U.S. holds the presidency of the Security Council, is going to be constructive, or, as the president-elect is fond of tweeting, sad. Which brings us to point 3. As this suggests, I think we're going to tell the story of the U.S.-UN relationship over the coming years as one of missed opportunities. Okay? And I've been studying Congress and funding in the IMF for years, so this sort of fits this pattern as well. Just as with funding for the IMF, funding for the UN is imperiled, and that was most certainly, in soccer parlance, an own goal. So this is certainly part of it, but there's two other senses in which this is going to be a missed opportunity. First, we're going to miss a real chance to engage Secretary General Guterres. He is a reformer. He campaigned on being a reformer. And I truly hope that he gets the chance to meet the president-elect. I mean, they're not too far across town, because I think he might just charm his socks off. He is the leader that the UN needs right now, because now more than ever, having someone who can communicate why the UN is essential and why the UN makes a difference, this is what is up for discussion. This is what is up for contestation. Second, we're missing a real chance to advance the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs were written with US input and advance American interests. And so while the environmental goals are certainly going to be put on ice by this administration, it'd be a real shame if the whole agenda was also shelved. Goal 16 is about building stronger, more capable states and about coupling state capacity with conflict prevention. And it'd be a real shame if that fell by the wayside. We've obviously made major progress fighting global poverty by working together, and it is a bit of an open question about the extent to which the White House values that. I need to end on a positive note. Some of you are thinking, please end on a positive note. And I am. Because here's the good news. The good news, ladies and gentlemen, is that right now there is no better place than here to be studying the UN. And there is no better time for you to get involved. Two opportunities. If you want to advocate for the UN, we have an award-winning campus chapter of the UN Association here on campus. I'm sure most of the executive board are here. Some of them are sort of going, so obviously they know who they are. So we will be filling a bus on Friday, February 17th for the annual UNA USA Members Day. So this is a chance for you to figure out how to get involved. And mass transit's on us. So there's that. Opportunity 2, if you've seen this in e-news, you know that we actively recruit each semester opportunities for graduate and undergraduate students to become youth reps, in which we give you an access pass and let you go to the UN, sit in on meetings, and come back and blog about what you have done. So for both these cases, these are opportunities for you to get involved if this is something that you want to pursue as we move forward. Thank you very much. And I'm now throwing over to Dr. Goldfein.
Thanks, Martin. So I just want to make 3 points about Trump and U.S. policy towards Latin America. The first is that, like virtually everything about the Trump presidency, there's uncertainty about what policy might look like towards the region. The second point is that Latin America as a region is highly unlikely to be a focus of U.S. foreign policy. And the third point is that if Trump carries out the policies he talked about during the campaign, particularly about trade and immigration, the effects on Latin America, on U.S.-Latin American relations, and on the U.S. are highly likely to be negative. So the first point is that there's uncertainty, and the uncertainty is for several reasons. One is that Trump said little about Latin America during the campaign. He said virtually nothing about Brazil, which is the largest country in the region, the most populous, the richest country in the region. Another reason for uncertainty is that some of what he did say, especially on Cuba, changed over time. Right? So he initially had no problem with Obama's opening to Cuba, but later he said he would negotiate a better deal and said he would overturn Obama's executive orders, some of which were directed towards Cuba. Furthermore, some of Trump's cabinet picks have said things at confirmation hearings that sounded at odds with the president-elect's statements, especially about Mexico. And I'm thinking of issues here like building a wall, deporting undocumented Mexican immigrants, and renegotiating or ending NAFTA. So Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State nominee, said he favored the TPP, which can't really be pursued while ending NAFTA. John Kelly said that deporting immigrant children was not a priority for Homeland Security. And finally, there's uncertainty because many of these campaign promises would be difficult, time-consuming, and expensive to carry out. And furthermore, they would generate considerable opposition, both from folks who did not vote for Trump, and also likely from within parts of the Republican Party and the business class that favor immigration and fear protectionist trade policies. The second point is that whatever form it takes, U.S. policy towards Latin America is not likely to be a priority for the Trump administration. For one thing, Trump almost ignored Latin America during the campaign. But more importantly, Latin America only becomes a priority for the United States when there are crises, right? And especially major guerrilla movements and revolutions that are interpreted as threatening to U.S. interests. As we know, the era of guerrilla movements and revolutions in Latin America is over. Right? The last major guerrilla movement in the region, which is the FARC in Colombia, has signed a peace agreement and is in the process of demobilizing right now, as we speak, under the UN supervision, I might add. So, policy towards Latin America is uncertain. It's not likely to be a major focus. But my third point is that while Latin America may not be a main focus of foreign policy, if Trump succeeds in carrying out the policies he promised during the campaign, the results will be negative and possibly disastrous. Specifically, if the Trump administration goes ahead with building a massive wall across the southern border and deporting millions of Latin American and Caribbean immigrants, the humanitarian crisis that already exists here and abroad will worsen dramatically. And there will be major economic costs for us all as well. Already, there are thousands of mostly Central American immigrants coming to the U.S. fleeing violence in Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Many of these are women and children. They're being housed in prison conditions along the southern border. Already, the Obama administration has deported more immigrants than any prior presidential administration, over 400,000 deportations per year, separating families, separating mothers and fathers from their children. It is hard to imagine that this could be increased even more and there would be no major outcry. Sending migrants back, especially to Central America, especially to the Northern Triangle countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, will put them in danger. There have already been cases of people being sent back who lose their lives from violence in those countries. Not only is there a humanitarian crisis, and that would be worsened, but it worsens, a massive deportation would worsen unemployment in migrant-sending countries, and probably more importantly, would deprive those countries of remittances. Right? Some countries in Central America and the Caribbean rely very heavily on remittances. Right? Over 15% of GDP in Jamaica and El Salvador, around 10% in Guatemala and Nicaragua. Right, but this would be bad for the U.S. economy as well. Communities with immigrants in the U.S. are more prosperous than communities without immigrants. Immigrants set up households, they buy things, they have children, right? More children than U.S.-born citizens do, right? And the wall would sour U.S.-Latin American relations more generally. Even countries that don't send many migrants to the U.S. would not look favorably on wall building and massive deportations. The same countries most affected by immigration policy, Mexico plus those countries in Central America and the Caribbean, would also be hardest hit if the U.S. pulled out of NAFTA and CAFTA-DR. Right, these countries rely on the U.S. market for exports much more than those in South America. About 75% of Mexico's exports are to the U.S. So it's no wonder that the value of the Mexican peso has dropped since Trump won the Electoral College. There would also be complications for the U.S. economy, as Professor Alam just pointed out. Manufacturers have developed global supply chains based on the rules of NAFTA and CAFTA, and that would be severely disrupted. But the hit to the U.S. economy would be much less than the hit to Mexico and Central America. So there's a potential for really disastrous consequences for Latin America if those policies are carried out. With regard to Cuba, which is the other country that Trump talked about a little bit during the campaign, it would be fairly easy for Trump to reverse some of Obama's minor executive orders, like allowing Americans to purchase rum and cigars. But it would be harder to reverse the policy completely, put in place new travel restrictions for Americans going to Cuba and things like that. But here, the stakes are much lower, both for Cuba and for the U.S. Cuba is likely to continue on its own quite slow reform process, regardless of U.S. policy. And the U.S. gains little from a hardline stance on Cuba. Such a stance would alienate our Latin American neighbors who had applauded the reopening of the embassies. And a retreat from our rapprochement with Cuba would also cut off opportunities for U.S. businesses and could potentially throw off or cut off opportunities for education and travel for all Americans. And that affects a nice group of 24 students here at the School of Diplomacy in March, because we're heading on a trip to Cuba with authorization from the new administration. So we'll see what happens in the first 100 days of the Trump administration. I doubt there'll be major changes, but it's a possibility. So to conclude, there's uncertainty about the direction of U.S. policy towards Latin America under Trump, but Latin America almost surely won't be at the top of the list of priorities. If his administration carries out dramatic versions of his campaign promises, however, the results will be highly negative and might cause such a major crisis that Latin America becomes a priority. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to begin by thanking Professor Edwards for spearheading this gathering today, and let me just say it's wonderful to see the great turnout. We've got a standing room only crowd, so thank you to you all for coming as well. As some of you know, I began my career several years ago, many years ago, in Washington, D.C., where I worked at several think tanks, and back then I was working on U.S. policy towards the Middle East, particularly with respect to the Iraq surge and the Arab-Israeli peace process. And it was exhausting. Every day felt like a new crisis. So when it came time to go back to school and pursue my graduate studies, I thought it would be a nice change, a safe, stable topic, some might even say boring topic, to look at NATO. All of that was, of course, before 2016, and only goes to show you that in diplomacy there are no safe, stable, or boring topics. But I'm actually cautiously optimistic when it comes to NATO, and I have a piece on a blog called Political Violence at a Glance that was published over the weekend that lays out some of the reasons why I'm cautiously optimistic. Since its establishment in 1949, NATO has never failed to protect its member states. It's weathered rough seas before, though admittedly none as rough as the current waters. Nevertheless, I think there's a parallel here with Professor Edwards' comments about President-elect's views towards the United Nations. They're similar towards NATO. On the one hand, we saw over the weekend, he gave a series of interviews in which he referred to NATO as an obsolete institution, an obsolete alliance. But on the other hand, he also clarified it means a lot to him. So what does that mean? I will say that I'm somewhat sympathetic to one of the common criticisms you hear about NATO, the concern about burden sharing. They are legitimate to me. Europe has been free riding on American taxpayers for years, but not in the way that the president-elect thinks. Trump has used the figure billions and billions of dollars to describe the shortfall between what Americans pay for NATO and what Europeans pay. But that's not exactly accurate. It vastly overestimates the amount of money the US government spends directly on NATO. Our direct contribution to NATO common funding is about $500 million a year. Now, $500 million a year is a lot of money, but not when you compare it to our overall defense budget, which this year, and I'm going to round up to the closest billion, is $583 billion. So that means about $1 out of every $1,000 that this country spends on defense goes directly to NATO. I would argue that's a bargain. What Trump is talking about, of course, is the alliance's goal for members to spend 2% of their own GDP on defense. This is where NATO members fall short. Last year, only 4 countries other than the United States met that threshold of 2% spending on defense. Poland, Estonia, Greece, and the UK. So who can do more? This will probably get me into trouble, but 2 of the biggest offenders to me are Canada and Germany, each of whom had done a lot with a little in places like Afghanistan, but who, given their size and their wealth, can do more. They spend only about 1% of their GDP on defense. In terms of what's next for NATO watchers like myself, I'm looking for a couple things in the next couple days and weeks, and then longer term in the next couple of months. First, for the next couple of days and weeks, I'm looking to see who will occupy the mid-tier diplomacy posts, who will be Assistant Secretary at State for Europe, Eurasian Affairs, but more importantly, who's going to be the Assistant Secretary at Defense in charge of NATO. Is it going to be a diplomat, someone with experience dealing with Europe, or a new hand? So this again goes back to Professor Edwards' comment about process mattering. I'm also looking to see whether the anticipated summer summit scheduled for Brussels. NATO usually has a summit every other year. The one this summer is going to be in Brussels. It was scheduled to be early summer. We don't have an exact date yet. I think it'll go ahead. What I'm curious about is whether President Trump will attend and the kind of reception he'll get at that gathering. Speaking to the medium to long term, what I'm looking at is whether European members of NATO will coalesce around NATO, will commit to strengthening that organization, or whether we'll see a gradual shift towards the EU's common security and defense policy, which has been our NATO rival for Europe for many decades. So those are a couple things that I'm looking for over the next couple days, weeks, and months, and I look forward to your questions. Professor Murphy.
Well, thank you very much. It is absolutely fabulous to see so many of you here. I only wish there were more chairs, and I want to echo all of my colleagues in thanking Dr. Martin Edwards for organizing this. I'm learning a lot too. So my task today is to talk about the likely implications of Trump's election on U.S. foreign policy to Asia. With regard to foreign policy writ large, I think we all know that Trump has set himself up to be the art of the deal president, and he intends to take a very transactional approach to foreign policy. He appears willing to cut deals with adversaries and to let alliances wither if they're not paying their fair share, as Dr. Muller's just indicated with respect to NATO. Now, when we move to Asia, it's an incredibly important region, arguably the most important for a number of reasons. Number one, it has some of the key security threats to the US, North Korea and its nuclear challenge. It's where China, arguably the US key peer competitor, resides. appears to be challenging the U.S.'s predominance in the region, making land grabs in the South China Sea. Asia is also home to some of the key allies outside of NATO in Japan and South Korea. Asia is also the key region driving economic globalization today, and Trump has obviously set out as a protectionist president. So Trump's short-term transactional approach is posing huge challenges both for the adversaries as well as for our allies. And this is in a region where long-term strategy predominates and is valued. And this is particularly troubling to many of the countries in the region because Trump does not appear to have an overarching world view. Some of his statements about America first, protectionism, etc., appear to indicate that he is going to follow a somewhat isolationist policy. On the other hand, he's made other comments, such as the need to double the military budget, which appear to suggest a much more confrontational, engaged America. So the combination of uncertainty, contradictory statements, and this transactional approach has raised a lot of concerns. So let's turn to China, okay? Because no country has gained more attention in a negative light than China from Trump during both the campaign and since. He's criticized its trade deficit, he's called it a currency manipulator, and said it must stop island building in the South China Sea. As you all know, he accepted a phone call from the Taiwanese president and has subsequently challenged the validity of the One China policy. This has been a bedrock of stability in the region because its ambiguity allows the U.S. to have cordial relations with both China and Taiwan at the same time. Publicly questioning this One China policy, which China views as an existential threat, has really raised concerns in China. They have called Trump an amateur, and they have said publicly that there will be retaliation if there is any movement on this policy. What he really intends to do, of course, is unclear. So combined with Trump's threats to start a trade war, as Professor Alam has noted, this has really set what appears to be a course for collision on Sino-US relationships. And this is what many analysts argue is the single most important bilateral relationship at this point in time. Not only because China is the key U.S. peer competitor, but also because China's cooperation on a whole slew of issues, from climate change to regional stability to North Korea, is viewed as key. And it's precisely for this reason that the Obama administration, Bush, Clinton before them, have placed such a priority on maintaining cordial relationships with China at the same time that they're trying to resolve conflicts in the relationship. So how this all plays out is really going to be unclear. So let's turn now to North Korea and its nuclear problem. As you all know, North Korea is a nuclear state. It's tested them 50 to 65 times over the recent years, and it is currently building an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, that if nuclear tipped could hit the west coast of the United States. Many argue that this is the single most important threat to the United States. And the question now is, what is Trump's policy going to be? He's tweeted that North Korea will not be allowed to complete and achieve this capacity, but he's articulated no problem. And if there's any area in which there is a land of lousy options, North Korea is it. Economic sanctions have not appeared to work. Economic bribery has not appeared to work. There are new sanctions. China's embargo of coal. The U.S. has just imposed new Treasury sanctions. But given the apparent intent of Kim Jong-un to proceed with this, it's very hard to imagine anything other than a military option really getting him to back down. And so the question then becomes, how do you proceed? One hopes that Trump is listening to the intel on this issue with more care than he apparently has on other issues. Trump has also criticized China, called on China to step in. And the disconnect here between setting relations with China on a collision course at the same time that he's calling on them to work on the North Korea issue is something that is worrying quite a number of people, and how this all plays out is going to be very unclear. When we shift to some of the allies in Asia, they're clearly worried about the future course of U.S. foreign policy. Japanese Prime Minister Abe made a trip to Trump Tower right after the election. The U.S. alliance with Japan is critical to Japan's security. He made that trip in order to convey to Trump that while some allies don't pay their fair share, Japan does, covering the costs of virtually all of the in-country costs of maintaining the almost 30,000 U.S. troops there. Any abandonment of Japan by the U.S. would likely lead Japan, given the threats from North Korea and China, to pursue nuclear weapons. That, of course, would set the region on a security spiral. If we turn to our other key ally in the area, South Korea finds itself in a similar situation to Japan, but obviously because it shares a border with North Korea, an even more precarious one. The North Korea threat is ratcheting up at the same time that South Korea is in the midst of its own domestic political crisis, with President Park recently impeached. And it's very unclear how a politically unstable South Korea is going to interact with a very unpredictable Trump. And so there's a lot of complexity and concern in that area. If we move to Southeast Asia, region close to my own heart, as you all know, they are extremely worried. Trump's comments on Muslims have triggered apprehension in an area that is home to more Muslims than all of the countries in the Middle East combined. China's assertiveness in the South China Sea is raising concerns among the countries who've been most directly targeted: Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei. Southeast Asia welcomed the Obama administration's pivot to Asia, and it had three components: the TPP, a military rebalance, and embrace of multilateral institutions. Professor Alam has indicated that the TPP is dead. This is extremely disheartening to the smaller countries of Southeast Asia that were partners to it. They had signed up, often cases in the face of domestic political opposition, because they wanted a hedge against China's economic dominance. The U.S. withdrawal leaves it open to China. Xi Jinping, as you noted, is in Davos, portraying himself as the leader of the global capitalist economic system, which is, when you think about it, the leader of the Chinese Communist Party is really, the world gone upside down. For the Southeast Asians, the Obama administration's embrace of multilateral institutions, joining the East Asian Economic Summit, showing up to the ASEAN meetings was critical because it gave them voice, it gave them a way to engage the great powers, the US and China, and try to mitigate their competition and voice their concerns. Obama backed up this policy with one of the most precious commodities in Washington, his time. With the exception of the 1 year when the government was shut down, he attended every EAS meeting. His secretaries of state attended all of the ASEAN meetings. There are many fears in Southeast Asia that this will not be continued under President Trump, given his transactional approach. Is he going to fly halfway around the world for what some argue are talk shops, but the Asians see them as key means for the U.S. and others to reassure. So in summary, I think that Asia is an area of great interest economically and security for the U.S. I think Trump's apparent approaches, although because there are no clear policies, we really don't know yet, we're speculating, have raised significant concerns. And the risk is that given the severity of some of the security challenges, not only are we in for a rocky road, but if you have some really significant missteps, particularly with regard to China or North Korea, you could set up disastrous consequences that would well outlast his administration. I was trying to find something optimistic to end on, like Dr. Edwards, but I couldn't find one. I'm really sorry. Thank you.
Thank you for the honesty.
My name is Father Brian, and I'd like to thank Dr. Edwards for his hard work on this panel. I'd like to thank my colleagues for sharing their thoughts. I've learned a lot. I hope my contribution will be as high quality as theirs. And I'd like to thank all of you ladies and gentlemen in the audience for showing up and sharing your time and attention. As President-elect Trump has prepared to assume office, commentators of all types have sought to ascertain his decision-making framework. Analysis can be hard, given Mr. Trump's propensity to express himself freely at the drop of a hat through various forms of media. His spur-of-the-moment articulations sometimes appear ambiguous, perplexing, and even self-contradictory. Some commentators have reacted as if Mr. Trump's ideas are completely alien to the mainstream of discourse, particularly with respect to nuclear issues. My goal this afternoon is to make some sense of the comments that Mr. Trump has made concerning nukes, and overall I want to ask, what are some principles that seem to guide, overall, Mr. Trump's comments on nuclear weapons? I wish to focus on three ideas that seem to recur in Mr. Trump's statements. I will connect two of these ideas to two corresponding scholars, and I will connect the third idea to prior US presidents. The first idea is about proliferation and policy. The second, nuclear threats and risks. The third, nuclear abolition. Let's start with nuclear proliferation, at least one aspect of it. Mr. Trump said to the New York Times in March of 2016, "Biggest problem to me in the world is nuclear and proliferation." Also in March of 2016, in an interview with Anderson Cooper, Mr. Trump said of the possibility of Japan, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia acquiring nuclear weapons, and I quote, "It is going to happen anyway. It's only a question of time. They're going to start having them, or we have to get rid of them entirely." Is this a step away from US non-proliferation goals, which have been meant to ensure peace and security? Well, John Mearsheimer has argued that selective nuclear proliferation and policy in certain places might be a good idea to promote stability and hedge against historical grievances. It seems that the president-elect may hold similar views given the geostrategic neighborhood of Japan, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia. What about nuclear threats, or in particular, the use of uncertainty and brinksmanship? In January of 2016, Mr. Trump said to CBS, "You want to be unpredictable." In March of 2016, he said to Bloomberg, "You know, we need unpredictability." And on the Today Show in April of 2016, he said, "I don't want to rule out anything." Why does Trump see the need for nuclear unpredictability? Well, Thomas Schelling, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2005, has written about what he calls the threat that leaves something to chance. And in so doing, Schelling argues that a good feature of such a threat that leaves something to chance is, and this is a quotation, that this kind of threat may be more impersonal, more external to the participants. The threat becomes a part of the environment rather than a test of will between two adversaries. The adversary may find it easier, less costly in prestige or self-respect, to back away from a risky situation than from a threat that is backed exclusively by our resolve and determination. He can even, in backing away, blame us for irresponsibility or take credit for saving both of us from the consequences. Mr. Trump may actually have a similar sense to Dr. Schelling. Concerning nuclear abolition, this is a bit interesting. You see, Mr. Trump recently tweeted that the U.S., quote, must greatly strengthen and expand its nuclear capability until such time as the world comes to its senses regarding nukes. Now, Max Fisher wrote in the New York Times a wonderful analysis of all of the ambiguities in this tweet and showed how it could be interpreted either as in line with President Obama's 2009 Prague speech or in line with North Korea's September statement on nuclear policy. Let's focus on the last part of the quotation. Until such time as the world comes to its senses regarding nukes. I believe that if you take that tweet together with some of the other quotations from Mr. Trump, including his belief that nuclear proliferation is the biggest problem, as I mentioned above, and his statement to Mr. Cooper, where he talked about proliferation being inevitable, or we have to get rid of them entirely, it may be that Mr. Trump at rock bottom is a nuclear abolitionist. This position would mean that Mr. Trump shares something in common with most, if not all, of his presidential predecessors. I'm reminded of an August 1954 press conference in which President Eisenhower argued, in essence, that the concept of a preventive war made no sense in the nuclear age. I'm reminded of President Kennedy's television address during the Cuban Missile Crisis when he said, and I quote, "We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the costs of worldwide nuclear war in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth, but neither will we shrink from that risk any time it must be faced." I'm reminded of President Reagan, who said, "A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, and we seek the total elimination one day of nuclear weapons from the face of the earth," in his 1984 State of the Union address and his 1985 second inaugural address, respectively. All of these quotations seem related to Mr. Trump's apparently imprecise tweet. That said, I have a few final thoughts. I am not saying that Mr. Trump's ideas are correct. I'm not saying that I've necessarily understood him correctly. I am trying to ascertain Mr. Trump's ideas pertaining to nuclear decision-making, and I'm trying to connect them to thoughts that others have had. In a brief talk like this, I cannot treat every quotation which the President-elect has uttered on the topic. I hope I have given a fair impression of some of his words and thoughts. Certainly, reasonable people can disagree with my interpretation of Mr. Trump's words. However, I have sourced my quotations carefully, and these cannot be disputed. Since I have been careful with my quotations, I would like to conclude with a different famous one. Speak softly and carry a big stick. A famous phrase uttered by then Governor Teddy Roosevelt in 1900. I think we will all agree that sticks don't get any bigger than nuclear weapons. The open question is, in President Trump's world, how softly will the US speak? Thank you.